How are we to make sense of the four horsemen of the apocalypse? We saw last time that the book of Revelation is not telling us so much about a future out there that it predicts. Kind of like the crystal ball, if we could just, the Bible predicts. It's more like a pattern. We don't need a crystal ball to know patterns of human behavior. How many of us know what our wife or spouse is thinking? How they will react, because we know the pattern. If I leave my socks on the floor, patterns. We don't need a crystal ball that someone is going to get on a white horse and start conquering. Putin, or Putin, however you say his name. Right? And has this happened before? This happens throughout human history. Someone thinks we'll make the world right if we get a war machine and we'll go out and we'll, This keeps happening. I don't need a crystal ball to know that. The book of Revelation is showing us humans patterns of human history that keep repeating themselves. From Alexander the Great all the way up to our day. And it's going to happen again, even after Putin. But here's a question. Why not just say this plainly, right? Why use all this weird language about horses, black horses and white horses and red horses? I mean, why do all that? And also it's contrasting the slain lamb representing Christ. Why not just say it plainly? Remember the old show Dragnet? Right? Just the facts, ma'am? I mean, why not just come right out and say it? Instead of using all this weird language. Well, a couple of reasons. One, you get in trouble sometimes if you use plain language. Right? If you were a slave in this country and you came out, as we slaves would like to go be free and go north. That's our heart's desire. You get in trouble. So what the slaves did is they came up with coded language. When they talked about going to Beulah land or heaven, it was coded language for, we want to get out of here and go north. But they couldn't say that, or they get in trouble. The church here is being persecuted, and they can't call Rome. They have to use coded language, so they call her a whore of Babylon. Coded language. The second reason is that plain language doesn't always capture the feeling, right? The horror of it all. So if I came to you and I said, someone just pulled the rug out from the whole church. That gives you a bigger feeling than, something bad happened. Right? That's apocalyptic language. Or, you know what? After today, the sun will never shine on me again. This language gives us a feeling. Goes beyond. It's exaggerated language to try to capture how terrible it is. A third reason, folks, we can see our times in this language. You see, if we limit the language of Revelation to something that happens out there in the future, well, I don't have to worry about it. We're not there yet. Or if it's in the past, well, that already happened. And so the problem is that we may not recognize that we're following a guy on a white horse. Like those in Russia who support Putin. They think he's the good guy. By the way, when you ever watch those old Western, what was the color of the horse the good guy rode on? The white horse with a white hat. You see, if we limit that to the future or the past, then we don't realize that we might be following a bad guy. This language is always, always, always relevant because it keeps repeating itself. The book of Revelation is trying to help us say, wake up. So the real question is not, will it happen or did it happen, but is it happening? Another objection. Apocryphal language is not the only problem we have here, because Jesus seems to be one breaking the seal and all this terrible stuff happening. Is Jesus the one wreaking havoc on the world? Is he the one punishing everybody for... No. He's not. So there you are. I want to move around. I can't. So there you are, and the sign says 35 miles an hour. That's the safe speed to go around the curve. And you go 100 miles an hour. And you end up in the ditch. And you go, God, why are you punishing me? No. God has established the limits of Satan. That sign there was to protect us. God has established limits within the world, within society, within humans, and if we follow that, we'll be blessed. If we go outside of that, we can expect to be in the ditch. So our scriptures are telling us, don't go in the ditch. Don't follow the guy on the white horse, because if you do, you're going to end up in the ditch. Humanity's going to end up in the ditch. Horrible, horrible consequences when we think the guy on the white horse has the answers. This is describing the passive wrath of God. If I go in the ditch, that's called the passive wrath of God. God didn't actively make me go in the ditch, right? I went in the ditch because I went outside the bounds of sanity. So we're trying to make sense of the four horsemen of the apocalypse on Mother's Day of all days. By the way, have you ever noticed how a really good reveals itself when you compare it to something terrible? That without the terrible, you don't really appreciate how good the good really was. How many of us in high school learned to type on these things called typewriters? Remember those? The younger people are going, what are they talking about? We had these typewriters, right? And if you made a mistake, what'd you have to do? You pulled out the white out, and you had to, go over it and then retype it. And it was terrible. But we didn't know it was terrible because we came from the non-electronic typewriters, right? You ever use those? Those are even worse. So when the computer came along, now all of a sudden we can say, wow, typewriters were terrible. Now they have this thing called spell check. Huh? Jesus, the slain lamb, is being compared to the riders on the white horse, the way humanity works, the way governments work, so that we might see how terrible it really is. Christ is the example of how he's the way, the truth, and life. That if we follow Christ, we don't end up in the ditch, and we need a comparison so we can appreciate just how bad it is. We need a terrible thing in order to appreciate how good some things are. This is why the resurrection and the ascension are so powerful, because it reveals how terrible the other alternative is. And then, against the backdrop of Christ as King, we see the horror of human leadership. Then I saw the Lamb open one of the seven seals. I heard one of the four living creatures say with a loud voice, "Come!" And there was the white horse, and he went out to conquer. The white horse symbolizes leadership bent on war. Any leader who goes out conquering on a horse is an antichrist. Peter picked up a sword and Jesus said, "Good job, Peter." No, what did he say? Put it away. Put it away. Jesus said, love your enemies. War doesn't solve anything. It's just another link in the chain of violence that just continues human insanity. We just get better and better at killing more people. Another link in the chain of violence. Against the backdrop of Christ as King, we see the horror of human leadership. And then against the backdrop of Christ's peaceful kingdom, we see the horror of war. When the Lamb opened the second seal, a red horse comes out so that people would slaughter one another. And he was given a great sword. Since 1900, it's been estimated that 90 million people since 1900 have lost their lives to war. And around half of those are civilians. It used to be that Christian nations had this thing called just war theory, that only soldiers could kill soldiers. We don't follow that anymore. Now we drop bombs on anybody and everybody. The Vietnam War, it was estimated that 2 million civilians were killed on both sides. And that was more than the actual soldiers who were killed. Against the backdrop of Christ's kingdom, we see the horror of war. And then against the backdrop of Christ's kingdom, we see the horror of greed. When I opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, "Come," and there I saw a black horse. And the one riding on it held a balance scale in his hand. And when I heard something like a voice in the midst of the four living creatures say, "A quart of wheat for a denarius, but do no harm to the oil and wine." You see, the motivation for war is greed. We either want to protect what we have or we want what somebody else has, as in the Gulf War. Or expanding greed because we want what someone else has. And the result of the greed is always inflation. You ever notice that? That with war comes inflation? Huh? That happens every time. And that's why it says here, you got to work all day for a quart of wheat. That won't even make a loaf of bread. Well, maybe a loaf and a half. Huh? But he says, but don't hurt the wine and the oil. Why? Who can afford the luxuries? Right? Let the poor people starve. But we'll protect the oil and the wine. Greed. In contrast, under the leadership of Christ, the early church went and sold their possessions and distributed to everybody who had need. Jesus spends lots of his ministry feeding people. There's more than enough for everyone in God's good world, but as someone has said, there's not enough for anyone's greed. So the white horse, they go out to conquer, and then you get death. And then you get inflation. By the way, who does inflation hurt the most? Poor people and people on fixed incomes. And so when you take the cumulative effect then of Christ's kingdom and you compare it to the cumulative effect of those expanding the empire through war, you see the horror of it all. The horror of it all. When he opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature say, "Come and look." And there was a pale horse, and the name of whom who sat on it was Death, and Hades followed him. Power over a fourth of the earth was given to him to kill with sword, with hunger, with pestilence, by the beasts of the earth. You start with a sword, many die, and then because of the sword, did you know many starve to death? Many in war die from famine. That always goes with war, by the way. It's one of the things that kills the most civilians is famine. After World War II, it is estimated that 5.7 million Germans starved to death simply because the Allied policy was to punish them. 5.7 million. Because we refused to love our enemies, we thought we should punish. After we did in World War I, we punished them, and that created World War II. You see, we just keep. And Jesus says, love your enemies. It actually makes sense. And then, of course, war leads to disease, pestilence. Disease and war work hand in hand. Right? So what happened when the conquistadors came to South America and Central America? What did they bring with them? Smallpox and all other kinds of diseases. They didn't win because they had a bigger army. The conquistadors won because they brought all their diseases with them. Smallpox. And anyone heard of Agent Orange? For most of human history, disease has inflicted a greater toll on combatants than the battles themselves. Our last horse shows the progression between those who go out to conquer and what follows: death, starvation, greed, disease. And then we compare that with the kingdom of Christ. And so, folks, the real hope for the world is not some empire, it's not some guy on a white horse. It's the kingdom of Christ. The Roman Empire, the Spanish Empire, the English Empire, the Soviet and American empires, they come and they go. And Christ remains, calling out, wake up. On Mother's Day, I wonder how many mothers lost a son, lost a child, because we just can't break ourselves from following the horses. You see, there can't be good news until we first embrace that there's bad news. The first step to fixing any problem is to acknowledge that there is a problem. The book of Revelation spends a lot of time showing us the bad news so that we're ready to accept the good news. The good news that in Christ there's a better way, a better king, a better kingdom, a better way of being human. You see, empires steal away our humanity. War always steals away our humanity. Every single time. They get us killing each other, starving each other. Christ gives back to us through the power of almighty grace, folks. All are welcome around this table, regardless of where you're from or your politics or your wealth or your lack of wealth or your sexual orientation. Everybody's welcome around the table where there are no swords, just peace and grace for everybody. All are welcome around the table of the slain Lamb. Amen.